everyone, to our innovation exchange for today. We have Adam Potthast joining us to talk about asking better questions. So I will go ahead and let him get started. And I guess whenever you're ready to share the screen, do you want me to go ahead and do that?
Yeah, go ahead. Bye, Amber. All right, I'm going to try to keep myself on target here. And I apologize to those of you who've been coming regularly to the special interest groups, because I do have a lot of duplicate material here, because I thought there was going to be a little different overlap between the two groups. But so I've been doing some serious thinking this time through about questions, because of course this is what a philosopher does. Is, you know, we started off in ancient Greece, if you go by the Western tradition, and the very first guy to try to pull this off was just pretty much obsessed with going and asking people questions that ruin their lives. And he ended up, you know, being killed for it. And of course, we all thought, that sounds great. You know, the you know, standard joke about the apology is that the unexamined life isn't worth living is like a proof. It's not a statement. So in Socrates' time, but I really got started thinking about this for considerably more mundane reasons, which is that you know, after teaching a course for a long time, I mean, I get really worked up about the ideas, and I was always someone who learned very effectively by having lectures. I mean, I really wanted to hear what the experts had to say, because at that time I couldn't get it off the internet, and I really only had that one chance, and there was only so much bandwidth. And so I, you know, naturally kind of gravitated to that way of teaching myself. Then I started to, you know, get involved with groups about that talked about teaching and learning. And I started to really kind of find out what rewarding discussions could be like. But then when I would try to take it into my classes, it would kind of go like, okay, here's this great thing. And, you know, Plato had this cave, and then people would come out of the cave, and then they would see the sun. And then I would say to my students, so what do you think about that? And they would all just sit there and say, I'm thinking, you know. But so I really was always embarrassed by my lack of skill, and I still am embarrassed by my lack of skill in finding good questions that would start off discussions that weren't just, you know, Ferris Bueller type, something DOO economics type discussion. So that's why I came up with this idea, and diving into it has actually been pretty rewarding. I've decided that the kind of key insight is that separating out questions that actually ignite discussions from questions that don't actually ignite discussions really seems to get back to the psychological trait that our students all have installed in them, it seems like, from high school, with the exception of, you know, the incredibly bright and motivated ones, which is that they're programmed to think that questions are designed to elicit the one right answer. And if you don't know that, then you don't speak up, because you don't want to be put on the spot. And of course, this is a theory that's antithetical to learning for all but the most gladiatorial-minded students. And those aren't necessarily the ones that need our help, especially at a place like Park. So what I've really kind of figured out, giving the first three elements of this special interest group, is that the way to kind of get good questions to give rise to good discussions is to ultimately try to push back as much as possible from this idea that you're trying to elicit the one right answer when you're asking questions from students. That's not to say you don't occasionally ask questions in order to get right answers, but the idea that you're searching for one is really important. And I think it kind of comes back to this phrase, which is not mine. I stole it from the Quest University YouTube video that says, you know, tell me and I forget, which wasn't true for me. Show me and I'll remember, which is true because I'm a Missourian. But involve me and I'll understand seems to me the part that actual good questioning taps into in students. So I like to think of questioning as the fundamental act of active learning. Like if you're going to do just one active learning thing, then questions and discussions are kind of where it gets started. So the first special interest group topic, I kind of came up with some bad questions and asked what we can sort of get them to show us about good questions. So if you come to one of my special interest groups, we do this thing called the question game, where you're not allowed to, you start by asking a question. You're not allowed to respond with a statement. You're not allowed to respond with more than a 4-second hesitation, and you're not allowed to respond with a rhetorical question. That's just basically a statement in disguise of a question. And originally I just did this to be funny because I saw an old video with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, and I thought this was fun, and I like to play it with people. But I've come to sort of see that it actually does kind of build these muscles of trying to get new information into the cycle of a discussion. So I've taken those sort of ways of thinking about question, the rhetorical questions, the questions that are simply yes or no answers or something like that. And it turns out that when you kind of negate those, then you start to get onto these good questioning techniques. But also the fundamental thing, other than deprogramming our students to make them better at discussions, is I think this. So we're all kind of brought around in this teaching culture that says discussions are fundamentally a good thing. But just like with every other kind of assignment or technique that you should, be sort of worried about, what's the purpose of my doing it in this class? I think that we probably don't think deeply enough about what the purpose of a discussion is in a class. So if you're going to have a discussion, then why? It's one thing to break down this feeling that you're alone in the room, which I've certainly done. I've had discussions because, good Lord, I just feel like the most egotistical person in the entire world, especially when I was younger and trying to teach older people philosophy. It just didn't make any sense. So, that's a psychological need to have a discussion, but what are we actually trying to accomplish in a class by starting a discussion? And the two things that I think really have come to the surface for me, and like I told the first special interest group, I'm sure this is wrong because I haven't put weeks thinking about it into play, but it's simple enough to get started. And I think the two really important functions a discussion can have in a class are to get students to converge on something that you already know that they need to learn, but you want them to build a path to it that's not your lecture to do it. So you want them to kind of come to some sort of understanding, and you can lead a discussion in a certain way that people do kind of come around to it and figure out a new way of thinking about something, or a fact that's got to be deduced from a couple of other facts. So that's one thing, to get discussion as a substitute for simply lecturing at them and getting them to say something or getting them to know something. But the slightly more powerful thing that a discussion can do is to complicate things in our students' heads. So before we want them to converge on the right answer, we might need them to expand their horizons a little, to destroy some of the old preconceptions about something that they know in order to build something new. And so I really think that, I'd love help from everybody here to kind of figure out whether it could possibly be this simple. But two of the main functions of starting a discussion are definitely to get your students to converge on something as a group, or to complicate something that they already thought that they knew. And got two kind of good questioning strategies that have kind of come out of this distinction. But of course, as a philosopher, I'm partial to complicating things, but with that power has to be used responsibly, because otherwise you annoy people and they cause you to drink poison. So they ask you to. You voluntarily drink the poison. This is just a little taxonomy of question types. It's kind of the best one I could find easily in the literature about asking questions that probe for facts and basic knowledge. These are probably the more basic questions you could ask. Ask students to make a conclusion about something, seek to identify the most important aspects, ask for cause and effect relationships, to create some sort of synthesis of disparate points. So on the left are, pretty basic, I think, kinds of questions that we all use, but it's helpful to have this little roster in your head when you're trying to brainstorm what kind of questions you think will lead to a good discussion. Excuse me, because when you're dealing with an incredibly long text and you have only a short amount of time in a classroom, you're probably going to want to ask some sort of priority question. What sort of things seem to be the most important? And one of the things that we want to teach students to do, especially in a humanities discipline like mine, is to kind of recognize that some things do standardly seem to be of more importance than others. So my students notoriously, read through things and pick out what I think is the least important aspect. Weirdly, that also happens to be in academic talks. But so I think that these two question types can be kind of grouped together into questions that tend to converge on a particular answer, and we want students to converge on them, and also to complicate things. Certainly, this will be available for people to look at afterwards if this is going too fast, but great. I realize that I'm 10 minutes in here. So the two major sort of questioning techniques I've covered so far are things called the Great Books questions, although while this is traditionally a humanities type tool, I was trying to lead my special interest group into using it to explain the earned income tax credit in the last time through. And I think, there's some things we can all learn about taxes by using these things. So the Great Books questions are good for guiding through students through a particular text. When they're presented with something that they're tempted to read from page 1 to page 400, and you need them to think more deeply about it as an object of knowledge that can not just be like a story to them, it's helpful to, first of all, get them all on the same page with what the author is actually saying. So asking questions of fact and getting them to dive in there and realize when they're asking questions of fact about what an author is actually saying puts them in a better position to be able to agree or disagree with the author down the line, and starts to kind of build that progression towards being scholars or responsible consumers of information. Clarifying what the person says is a good first step. So asking students to classify their questions when questions of fact about what the author is actually saying allows you to move on to the next step, which doesn't actually point to the book to answer a question, but asks students to figure out whether they agree with what the author is saying or not. And guy's slipping my mind, the Great Books guy, Mortimer J. Adler, sort of pushes students next to ask whether or not the author has things that they agree with them. And this is where students don't point to the text to answer questions, but point to their own experience to say, no, Plato was full of crap. I, deal with appearances all day long, and it's actually a perfectly respectable activity or something like that. Or when you're reading the tax code, you can ask yourself whether or not you agree that indeed a eligible child can be a brother rather than just a biological descendant or something like that. And then finally, one of the sort of higher levels of learning that goes on in the Great Books questions is by asking people about questions of interpretation, which asks them to take pieces of the text in order to build an interpretation for what the author is trying to say. So instead of pointing just one place in the text, they might point to several places in the text to say that a particular philosopher or historian, or maybe even artist, if your texts are not completely word-based, is trying to make a point by referring to several different aspects of the work that's under consideration. So I think these questions can be useful in organizing the questions you ask to your students, but they can even be even more useful when you get students to think about the questions they have in terms of these three areas. And if that's all a little bit too many words, I like to kind of break things down a little bit. So questions of fact are questions about what they say. Questions of evaluation, will I say? And questions of interpretation are, say what? That what kind of higher meaning are we maybe missing here by just concentrating on particular parts of the text? This lends itself very nicely, as I was saying in my last special interest group, to a exercise where you have students write down simply they say and I say on two sides of the paper, and they write down what the author says, and then they react to it on the other side of the paper. And then done here in just a little bit. The other side of things, if the great books questions are places where we get people to converge and figure out what the great books mean to them, or what the tax code means to them, you can turn the whole page and get to Socratic questioning, which is the reason I kind of fell into this. So Socratic questioning is where you abandon any kind of idea that you're in front of the class in order to get students to believe something that you already believe. It doesn't necessarily work for classes where the primary thing is to hand over knowledge. I don't know how exactly you do, zoology with Socratic question. What's that?
Zoology.
I pronounce it zoology.
There'd have to be another O in there, but it was okay. Sorry.
I think they're dialectical differences. We could tear apart this presumption or something like that. But so famously, Socratic questioning is used in law school. Of course, we also use it in philosophy. It's very useful in the humanities in general to kind of get students to pick apart their assumptions behind what they already believe about something. And the idea is to move them towards a state of intellectual accountability for their own knowledge. So they no longer rest on the things that they believed prior to being asked Socratic questions, because the instructor leads them in a sort of deconstruction of them, so they can decide what pieces to pick up and take forward in their knowledge from here on out. So the instructor encourages productive discomfort. The instructor doesn't try to push an agenda. If the student asserts something, then the instructor constructively denies it. If the student denies something, then the instructor provides the questions that lead them to wonder why it was ever assumed in the first place. And you kind of work at both ends of knowledge to try to get them to kind of own it and realize where their beliefs are coming from. So open-ended questions are the things, and then the key is in the follow-up questions that you ask the students. I like to think of this, I was a Missouri master naturalist, which apparently somebody says involves nudity or something. I think that's a naturist. But a naturalist, when I was in Rolla, we just sort of did all these things about how to grow gardens and maintain prairies and ponds and everything. And one of the key ideas that I found really rewarding was the idea that you set fires in order to preserve the integrity of an ecosystem, which didn't make any sense to me at first, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about what Socrates did to all of human knowledge, that basically you tear it down so that new things can build out. So I really like the idea that Socratic questioning is a controlled burn in a classroom. And the keys to it are, like I was saying, always follow up, and you have to kind of be on your toes and have to constructively deny it. It really matters that you practice this beforehand. You can't simply come to, I don't really know how I would write down a bulleted list of things that you could say after a student asserts something in a class. So you have to practice it with your colleagues or your significant other or your family or something. But the really key thing to do here, and I think this is what made Socrates so brilliant about his questioning, was that there's big debates about Socratic irony, but you really have to believe that he doesn't believe that he knows anything in order to get this system to work. It's very tempting when we've got very smart students to use Socratic questioning as a way of maintaining our authority in the classroom, which we lost 20 years ago when the internet was invented. But Socratic questioning is really not about that, and it can really spoil it if you use it to intimidate or dominate your students, or to convince them that somehow you're the smartest person in the room and they need to kowtow to you. It's really about the students and deconstructing their knowledge, and if you can put aside the ego that kind of comes along with being wrong or occasionally failing or something like that, then that's really the key to do it. You really can't do this as a psychological health or psychological confidence builder for yourself, because it won't work. Whenever students appeal to authority or the reading, well, they say this in the book, you challenge that by asking whether or not that's a good thing to believe. Do you think that that's right? Well, B.F. Skinner says this. Why does B.F. Skinner say that? Wouldn't this be contrary to what this person said from the other reading that we're talking about? You get them into thinking about the dialectic between the things that are out there. Remember that their instincts will beat a battle. And observe the 15-second rule. I've gotten a lot of situations this particular semester where I ask a question and then there's just silence. And I wait. And I had some professors that would tell me, no, just keep waiting. I'm not that guy. I cannot wait for more than a minute without getting serious interference up here. Self-doubt creeps in and it just all goes wrong. So a great technique for this, if silence breaks out, is to break them into small groups and ask each one of the groups to discuss the question you just asked and see if one of those groups has something to put forward. And then you can sort of continue on the cycle of questioning. So, yeah, let's see. This didn't. Oh, good. And this is the last slide. Yeah. So welcome serious ideas, fresh ideas, crazy ones, discourage unserious ones. That's an important technique. Don't linger too long, but interruptions are actually okay. Try to imagine where your students might go. Consider a reflection exercise afterwards to kind of get them to summarize what the dialogue was all about. This technique works a little bit better or a little bit worse if you're trying to be your student's friend too much, because it's about producing productive discomfort, and that's not a thing that we do in our friendship relationships for too long. It goes wrong. So you do have to give up a little bit about being the buddy professor if you want to engage in this, because students won't necessarily trust that you're guiding them along the same lines. So that's just a couple of things that I've learned so far. I hope it's somewhat useful to kind of build into some of your classes or mind for it, but we've got some time for discussion and stuff. So thanks. What do you think?
You know, one heard you say, when you talk about when the students, one of the things that's been helpful to me in the last few years is to stop the language of the book says and insist on the name of the author. Because you have to endorse the idea of the fallibility of the author before you can really have an open discussion about a text.
Yeah, I find that works a little better when the author is someone that they know, as opposed to an author who just happens to be an author of a textbook who they don't have any association with. So I think the author of my ethics textbook is great, Anthony Weston, but they don't know it. They think Weston is the place where the Irish Festival happens. So, so to them it's received ethical knowledge, and yeah, it's really hard to break them out of that thing unless it's Socrates or Plato or Darwin or someone like that.
Well, even so, the textbook, I mean, even if this is like a $300 everything you need to know about microeconomics textbook.
Oh no, zero textbook costs.
Right. Still, the guy has a name, and there are other people who are also writing about the same material. I think that makes sense. I mean, demystify the textbook, because they often think that this is, this is basically the 10 Commandments. They just have to pay for it instead of having to give it to them.
And I think that's a transition between encountering what I think in high school is an academic subject as opposed to an academic discipline. So getting them to think about a discipline allows them to be a participant in something where it's a subject, they're just receiving the knowledge. And yeah, so I try to come back to that too. Jody.
Do you tell your students ahead of time what your game plan is, that I'm going to pose this question and I'm going to kind of play the role of Socrates and try to cause you some productive discomfort so that they kind of know where you're coming from, or do you just do it, as you roll along?
I'm still trying to work up the courage to deploy Socratic questioning for any long period of time in my classes. I'm working on a body of research here, but I've done no more than maybe 20 minutes of it at a time in a class. I haven't actually done a whole course where I've done that in because I'm not ready to take that leap. But usually I do reassure them that I'm not trying to
Trip them up.
I'm just trying to get them to unpack things that they already believe. I've had it fail bad in that 20 minutes, and I've had a fairly rewarding 20 minutes. But and that's one of the reasons I'm doing this, is so that I can learn better what that technique actually is. And for the record, everybody disagrees about the techniques, virtues, and vices. I have no idea how people teach law this way. It's baffling to me. They simply need to know too much about the law. And it seems like, we're going to take a semester in law school to teach them how to think. That seems like way too much time to waste. But I need to pair up with a law professor and see how they do it.
It also seems easy to fall into a one-to-one discussion very quickly where you have the single student who's responding rather than multiple people. I'm trying to think of how you would ensure that doesn't.
Yeah, well, in the traditional Socratic questioning, students are allowed to respond to the other students as well. But they're so used to seeing you as a Socratic figure or something like that they do talk to you. So what people usually urge people to do is to get students to respond to other students as well. And then you can occasionally come in and complicate the debate between the two students.
That's the coolest thing when you can do it.
Yeah, you're lucky. It feels like, you just got on the surfboard or something like that, and try not to fall off. But the breaking them down into smaller groups is the other thing to do. Once you've started to do it, they actually start to do it to themselves. But weirdly, their motives are a lot worse than yours. Right? They want to damage the guy who won't shut up in class, and you have to kind of find something.
And you do too. You just
That's right.
But you're glad to have somebody respond at certain times instead of having this dead silence.
sometimes you love that guy.
Sometimes you're just like, this is, you open your mouth and now it's not going to work the rest of the time. I wish I could figure out how the psychological mechanism behind that so I could reroute it, but I don't have time.
I want your philosophy question again, where it was like a geologist, a philosopher, a pregnant woman, an electrician, go into an elevator and has to be killed or whatever. What was the question?
Yeah, so that was in 8th grade. It was Mr. Osterberg. He was a substitute English teacher who got fired very soon after for reasons I don't understand. And it's a Catholic school, and he came into class and he said that you're in a bunker. It's after a nuclear explosion has happened, and you're in the bunker with a scientist, an artist, a pregnant woman, an athlete, and I forget what the 5th one was. I'll have to look that up. What's that?
Sociologist? No.
It wasn't a sociologist. Maybe a social scientist. That would be fun. Actually, that would be a fun way to get people to defend their discipline.
Yeah.
To throw that person in there and see what they could say. But you only have enough food for 4 people, so you have to kick somebody out, and then you get students to debate the relative merits of continuing the human race versus figuring out a way out of this versus. I think maybe one person's a chef or something.
Okay. I'll look it up from there, but I really wanted to use that.
Yeah, like I said, it stuck with me for a long time. I'm probably a philosopher because of that question.
I have a question about the non-serious ideas.
Yeah.
And discouraging it.
Yeah.
Okay, first off, a lot of times are you saying these people know they're non-serious about it? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
No,
they're just not taking it seriously.
Yeah, they're just not they're poking fun or something like that.
Okay.
No, when they're speculating, that's good. But when they say, gotta, got to throw the feminist out no matter what, or something like that.
Oh, okay.
You know, you got to press them.
So
on
they
those
know
kinds
they're
of
being,
things.
okay, so how do you discourage it then?
You tell them it's not a serious question and you want to sort of
Okay.
entertain speculative questions,
Okay.
but not ones that distract from the debate.
So you do call them on it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Plato's never included those in the dialogue, so we don't even have them.
Trolls.
Actually, yeah, book 1 of the Republic is Plato dealing with a troll.
Okay.
Yeah, his name is Thrasymachus. He's the original troll, and debatably, Socrates loses to him. So, I mean, the arguments work out, but he's very proud of himself after it's all over.
You know, when you think about it, all I know is that I know nothing. This actually works the best when you don't know the answer. I mean, you really have to subvert your ego and be, you know, I found that I had to be more socially confident in the classroom before I could do it. But if I don't know the answer and I ask the question, I can get a much better discussion. But I have to admit to myself that, you know, I've asked a question that I don't know the answer to. That's dangerous, but it works. It works.
Yeah, there's a great course. I think someone at Reed College invented it, called the Dangerous Ideas, that they teach, and it centers around Darwin and Socrates and all these other people. But cutting off. Okay. So yeah, I definitely learn best when I don't know anything. I don't know that I teach the best when I don't know anything. It's hard to kind of get straight into credit questioning, but the goal no longer becomes the acquisition of knowledge so much as a psychological openness to knowledge that you prepare in your students. And some of them just aren't going to take it well. So it's really, it's kind of like a form of therapy more than it's a form of, but knowledge grows back. They come better able to absorb things the next time, I think.
All right, y'all. Well, I'm sure we would like to continue this conversation. We want to be respectful of your time, and we did say this would be over 5 minutes ago. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you again to Adam for sharing with us. And we hope you will check out some of his future SIG meetings and next month's Innovation Exchange.
I think October 26th is the next one. So.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, Marcy.
Each one you do is actually